Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Over the last couple of days, I've heard a lot of people talk about how dissatisfied young people in America are with the state of politics, of current affairs, of capitalism. But tonight, we have a chance to actually hear from those young people themselves. We have three very impressive young political digital creators from all across the political spectrum who are going to be talking to us about the way TikTok and social media basically have influenced and changed the way their generation, Gen Z, is receiving politics, is consuming their news. And to do so, we have Jack Blanchard with us. He is the managing editor and author of Playbook, which is Politico's must-read newsletter. Every power player in Washington, D.C. reads it every morning. So I'm very excited to have him because he will bring a very, I think, unique look on American politics. He just moved here just a few months ago from London, where he started London Playbook. He covered, the turbulence of Brexit and the revolving door of British prime ministers. So I think I'm very happy that we have him here to help us grapple with American political culture. Also, a reminder, after this session, Politico, Jack and his colleagues will be hosting a nightcap at West End Social. So that'll be a great occasion for all of you to kind of digest what you heard tonight and keep the conversation going. So I hope to see you all there. And I'm going to leave to Jack and the panel now. Good luck.
All right, thank you very much, Peter. Peter's given my secret away. I was going to try and keep it under wraps that I'm not actually American, but unfortunately now you all know. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see such a full room as well. Thank you all for coming down. We're here to talk about TikTok, as you know, and how that has changed politics over the last few years. Before I introduce our amazing panel, I'd just love to know how many people in the room here actually go on TikTok regularly. How many of you guys, hands up, are like on it almost every day? Come on. Not that many. All right. And, okay, that's good because we're here to learn, and we have a panel of people who are experts on this. I'm going to introduce Brad first because he's furthest away and I don't want him to feel left out. Brad Palumbo is the host of the insanely popular Brad versus Everyone podcast and has become a phenomenon on YouTube and on TikTok. You've got hundreds of thousands of fans there. You describe yourself as a center-right independent journalist. Is that about right? Okay, good, thank you. We have Jamie Franklin. Jamie is the founder of The Conservateur, which I was reading the Vogue article about this. It was described as, I was reading the New Yorker article about this, which called it Vogue, but for Trumpers. Is that fair? Is that fair?
Sure.
Okay, it's an online magazine, very popular, particularly focused on Gen Z and on conservative and alt-right members of Gen Z. Last but by no means least, we've got Dean Withers. Dean is a superstar of liberal, progressive social media. You are, man. Like, in a very short period of time, 2 or 3 years, Dean has built up a following of literally millions of people on TikTok. Dean makes videos, they're polemics. Dean often argues with a conservative opponent, and literally millions, sometimes 8-digit figures of people watch these videos. Dean used to be known as the woke teen, but I think you're no longer a teen, is that right?
Well, that video recorded 1 month before it turned 20.
Right, there you go, just snuck in as a teen. So we've got a brilliant panel of people who really understand this stuff. I want to hit you with a couple of facts about TikTok before we get into the discussion, just so that we know why this stuff is so important. Something like 120 million Americans say they use TikTok every month. That's 1/3 of the population. It skews very much younger, as you probably know and would expect. The research this month said that 2/3 of Americans aged 13 to 17 use it. 2/3 of them, most of them every day. More than half of Americans aged 18 to 30 are on TikTok. If, like, lots of people in the room don't use it regularly, you might think TikTok is still all about dance routines and, I don't know, cats falling into trash cans and stuff. No. Survey last summer, half of TikTok users aged 18 to 30 said they used the platform to keep up with politics or political news. It's for many people, it is now a primary resource for how they come to understand politics, and that's why this discussion is so important, particularly for the younger generations. And if you needed any more evidence of how important it is, look at President Trump, who every so often breaks the law to stop TikTok being banned in this country because he understands how important it is to him and to his campaigning. So we're going to learn about TikTok and politics today. What we're not going to do, one rule we're not going to do, we're not going to have a big partisan row about politics, right? I have to put up with that all week in DC. You guys have to put up with all week in DC. We're not here to argue about politics. We're here to talk about this phenomenon and why it's really important. I want to start with Brad because he's furthest away. Why has politics become a thing on TikTok, do you think? What is it about the medium that has made it popular as a form of political discussion in a way that probably people didn't expect when it first arrived?
Well, I think in media more broadly, we've seen a pretty significant shift away from big brands and big networks where people trust and go to get their information, and instead towards individuals, right? So people, I mean, some people still do, but people are less likely to follow a general network or read a newspaper than they are to follow Ben Shapiro or Joe Rogan or their many left-wing equivalents. People have really become attached to mini cults of personality for their media and news consumption, for better and for worse. We could go into the reasons why that in some ways breaks a harmful quasi-monopoly that a few media outlets historically had on accessing information and distributing it to the public. We could also talk about the many downsides of it, and I'm sure we will. I think TikTok is basically young people's version of that. They don't want to get the news from a faceless anchor who they don't know because they just flip on and that's who's in that block at that hour. They don't want to read because young people don't read. It's just true. It's sad to me. I originally wanted to be a writer when I graduated college in 2019, and that lasted about a year before I realized that if I wanted to have any impact whatsoever, I would have to pivot to video and social media. So I think it's really that it allows you to build faith. I mean, this person's literally speaking to you in a very intimate setting, from their kitchen, from their bedroom, from their car. And you build trust and rapport with an individual person. And I think that's why it's become so big. But I also think that gets people engaged, but it can also be perilous, because then fringe voices on either side, if people become attached to them as a personality, will follow them into dangerous, radical, or even conspiratorial territory. So, I mean, there's pluses and minuses to that.
Jamie, you've written a lot about Gen Z. I see you on TV. I'm talking about Gen Z. How important is TikTok to your network that you've built, and how much do people in that sort of demographic, how much do you feel like they're not just using it every day, but actually being influenced by it every day?
Yeah, and I think, I totally agree with everything Brad was just saying, that young people are going onto TikTok, they're going onto X, they're going onto Instagram to get a lot of their news. But I think for Gen Z, politics is not just about healthcare policy or taxes or immigration. There's a real cultural revival happening in this country, and it's happening on social media, both on the left and right. And so, for example, with young women who I talk to a lot in the conservative movement, they're watching trad wives, they're watching women, talking about making their sourdough, they're listening to women talking about going to church, going and being a wife and getting married and motherhood and all these other issues that really do feed into how people vote. And so I think we would be remiss not to mention how important the cultural movement is that floods into politics.
And so some of these things are not necessarily overtly political, but they're part of a bigger...
They're coded right wing, and then there's also things on the left that are coded left wing, whether it be like tattoos or blue hair or liking coffee or talking about your cats or dogs or whatever. There's kind of, cliches on both sides. But definitely, I think young women especially, we're listening to voices that we see on social media, and we're following them, and their lifestyles and culture really influence how we're voting in the voting booth.
Did you feel like there's something about the medium itself that works for you? Like how have you harnessed this particular medium to be so popular in terms of the number of people watching?
Yeah, I think I think getting on, I think for men a lot, they're kind of leaning in towards Reddit, they're leaning into podcasts. I think for women, we're also leaning into podcasts. I think TikTok is especially big for women. I think Instagram is huge. We all remember during multiple social movements and stuff, people posting their infographics online, and so that's how a lot of people are communicating with one another and sharing their thoughts. And I'm a big believer in free speech, and I think sunlight's the best disinfectant. And so I think it's been actually although there's a lot of debate and turmoil in our country, I think it's been overwhelmingly positive because it's having a chance to go to the public square and debate a lot of these issues out.
And Dean, what do you think? What is it about the medium of TikTok, particularly that makes you able to get your message across and makes people so engaged with it?
Sure, that's a good question. Well, first and foremost, I'd say a lot of the younger Americans consume most of their news off of TikTok because it's easier to access than maybe going to apnews.com and figuring out how to use their website to find news relative to any particular political issue or anything going on nationwide. Younger Americans are already on TikTok. They're using TikTok to consume short-form content related to their own interests. And what will happen is, in consuming this content related to their own interests, regardless if it's doom scrolling for 3 hours after an 8-hour shift, or waking up to see what your favorite creator posted, is in that algorithm, you'll start getting recommended stuff about the news, about politics, because the way that politics works in our country today, and has always worked, is controversy brings a lot of attention. There's a lot of eyes on things that are controversial. There's a lot of eyes on things that can scare people. There's a lot of eyes on things that maybe people think could personally impact them in any way. And on TikTok, the algorithm really likes to push that content out to as many people as possible because individuals are more likely to watch it all the way through, engage with it, share it with their friend. So I would say that the algorithms on these social media websites are highly favorable for political and news-based content. And this is really factored into what I do because I'm on the other end of that. I'm the one putting out the content. And something that I always keep in my mind is, okay, I want to be able to deliver the same information that, reputable institutions reporting on news or in politics deliver, A, in a way that is easy to understand by the average younger American who doesn't know much about politics or maybe is just getting into things, and B, formatted in a way that the information is presented to them in a way that is easy to consume and easy to access. And I think those are my thoughts.
But Dean, so algorithmically, I think you're spot on. But I think the problem is the incentives that creates. So I just spoke recently with my grandmother who's about to turn 90, and she asked me what I thought about Barron Trump's wedding. And I said, oh? Because Barron Trump has not, in fact, gotten married. She had seen an AI video on Facebook. And I think we're all familiar with kind of that end of disinformation and like fake news and things that spread. I think TikTok is Gen Z's equivalent of that. Because what controversy sells, if it bleeds, it leads, has been translated to the digital era. So now, I particularly focus on kind of monitoring what political creators on TikTok are saying, and they tend to skew to the left, though there's also a right-wing ecosystem on there. They are constantly getting worked up about things that are happening, and then they're also getting worked up about things that are not, in fact, happening. There was an entire news cycle meltdown on TikTok where millions of people genuinely believed Trump was reinstating segregation in America because he repealed a Lyndon Johnson-era executive order about affirmative action. But if you understand how the law works, if you understand how executive orders work, if you just think about it for more than 5 seconds, he obviously wasn't reinstating segregation. But that's quite literally the belief that millions of people have. There was also another story just recently where the nuances of politics and policy that traditional reporters understand, or that people like us understand, are just lost on the public on TikTok and on the opportunists who want to go viral. So when a red state at the state level, a bunch of Republican lawmakers pass a meaningless resolution calling for the Supreme Court to overturn Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court case that legalized gay marriage, the narrative on TikTok was the Supreme Court is about to overturn Obergefell v. Hodges. But those two things are actually unrelated. That's not a case that the Supreme Court can hear. And there's nothing in their docket that suggests they're revisiting that. They could, but that's not what's happened yet. So I just worry about the algorithmic side of TikTok and how it fuels kind of the digital Gen Z version of grandmas falling for AI slop.
Dean, do you find you have an incentive to be kind of as, like, maybe not controversial, but certainly you want to be eye-catching, right? Doing what you do, there must be an incentive. You want to get as many viewers as possible. That's the business we're all in. Do you find that gives you an incentive to be as controversial as possible the way you frame things?
That's a good question. I'd say that incentive exists for many people in the space. At the end of the day, that's how you get your numbers higher. But something I've personally always, excuse me, something I've always personally focused on is trying to be reliable, trying to be truthful, and try not just to fearmonger my audience because I know at the end of the day it'll give me higher numbers. Because at the end of the day, I just want to make sure that as many people as possible are informed on what the facts are. But I will say, to your point, Brad, is there is plenty of people on the platform that like to exploit that, take advantage of it, because as long as you could push a narrative that is eye-catching and stirs controversy, it will catch eyes and it will stir controversy. But on the flip side, when we're looking at the more traditional media ecosphere, you're either watching somebody on your TV or you're reading a report online, and what is true of a platform like TikTok that's not true of traditional media is accountability in the viewership through things such as live commenting, reposting it, responding to it. See, when I turn Fox News on my TV, I'll hear about how Dominion rigged the 2020 election, and until they lost in court, I had my mom, my dad, my sisters, my brothers all believing this because that's what the person on the TV was telling them, and there was nobody else to tell them anything else. So I'd say there's definitely pros and cons to alternative media such as TikTok and more traditional media.
I just think there's a little bit more of, and maybe it's dying or going the way of the dodo bird, of journalistic or professional ethics and introspection. So like Fox News fired Tucker Carlson, right? After that lawsuit. A massive TikTok influencer who spreads fake news, or a right-wing YouTuber who spreads a fake story. Matt Walsh comes to mind. He did a whole show, a segment on his show, talking about how the Supreme Court blocked Trump's attempt to deport people from the country. Basically, we can't do it. It was actually a case that involved about 70 immigrants under the Alien Enemies Act, about 70 people. He claimed the Supreme Court shut the door on the whole Trump deportation agenda. So he didn't get fired, right? His numbers didn't dip. Neither did many of these influencers. I just think it was deeply flawed. But I think old school media had a little bit more of accountability and professional ethics.
Let me bring in Jamie. How critically minded do you think Gen Z are when they're watching this stuff? Do you feel like you're seeing people being influenced sometimes in ways where you're like, that's just not true, guys? Or do you feel like people actually have more credulity than maybe someone of my generation looks at these videos and goes, this is crazy, than I'm giving them credit for?
Well, I think that we have to talk about how the mainstream media lost the trust of the American people. It's at an all-time low. I think that's on the heels of COVID. And I think mainstream media is based out of DC, New York, and maybe LA. And so it's not representing a lot of people in the middle of the country and their point of view. And even when you bring up Tucker Carlson, he's an opinion journalist. Matt Walsh is an opinion journalist. And so I think the American people are smart enough to understand the difference between an opinion journalist and someone who is saying, I'm straight fact reporting on the news. And unfortunately, in this day and age, we don't have a lot of people who I believe are straight fact reporting on the news. There's always a tilt to it. And I think in our generation, we know that. And we're looking, like for myself, for example, I listen to many different voices. I listen to Pod Save America. I listen to Matt Walsh. I listen to Tucker. I listen to people across the spectrum. And then I can come to my point of view on what I think is correct out of all of that. And I think that's something that our generation really does because we're consuming so much content on TikTok. It's like one video after another. And so I think people are smart and people undervalue that Americans can make up their mind and they can differentiate between, facts and maybe opinions and what they really believe.
I want to talk about the political divide on TikTok. And I should say, we are going to do a Q&A at the end of this. So do have a think. If you've got questions for these guys, have a think now. There's a perception, and it's been written a lot about in the media, that certainly last year, the right side, the right of the argument, the right wing, basically had a lot of success in the TikTok space, and that was one of the many factors which helped to fuel President Trump's election victory in November. That's sort of become received wisdom. And I'm interested to know, first of all, how true you guys think that is. Dean, is it right that certainly up until the start of this year, it was a more successfully influential from the right wing?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. And maybe the reason I'd say that is correct is because what the data shows, but I mean also what I see. And I think I'll kind of wrap in something you had shared. Maybe your perspective is that Gen Z has really good brains on their shoulders and they're able to decipher if the content they're watching is true or false. I would disagree.
Well, I'll say, I was able to detect that Joe Biden's mental decline back in 2020, and yet the mainstream media didn't report on it and then acted like they pretended that they found out just a few months ago. So I would say a lot of Gen Z content people and on the right were already detecting that years ago.
But then they didn't detect.
And we were vindicated in that.
But what they didn't detect, for instance, I'll give a handful of examples here, is how maybe the inflation that we saw in America for the last 4 years wasn't caused by Joe Biden, but was caused by the pandemic. What they didn't detect was a cohort of other things, maybe along the lines of how our administration was actually trying to fight for the average everyday American, and Biden wasn't a puppet on strings by the rich billionaires, maybe. And there's a whole list of things, and I think I encounter these every single day, because what I do in my professional life is I'll sit in my studio for 4 hours a day and talk to Trump supporters about why they support Trump. And for the most of it before the election, it was all about how the gas was too expensive, or maybe how when they would go to the grocery store.
Low now.
Well, I mean, that is because we saw a surge in imports in the first quarter of this year, which caused our GDP to dip via a scare of the tariffs, not to mention the future markets of oil.
We are in danger of breaking my only rule of this discussion. Although this is really good. This is really good. Let's not spend the next 20 minutes debating Joe Biden's record. I don't know if you know, there is content on the internet where you can do that.
That's right.
You guys have...
Summation of the point is very simple. I think that a lot of people, especially in the younger generations, can be heavily misled by a 7-second headline.
There is another thing that has been written about, which is that actually we talk about Gen Z, and I've been doing it in this conversation as if it's one homogenous group. And of course, that's not true of any generation. But there has been something specifically identified, which is almost like there's two Gen Zs, and you've maybe read about this or you have thoughts about it, that the pandemic was such a watershed moment for so many young people, and of course it was, that I guess the younger cohort essentially splits further right. Do you think that's right, Brad?
Well, I actually think there's almost a gender dynamic to it.
Okay.
What I see in the numbers, and obviously you can find people on either side, I see Gen Z men skewing right and Gen Z women skewing left, perhaps more so than other generations. I certainly didn't anticipate this, because when I started my career, it was all about how young people love socialism, young people were very left-wing. I think the pandemic changed things for a lot of people. I think they lost trust in a lot of institutions. School closures were really harmful, and they happened everywhere, but they were significantly worse in many blue states under many Democratic governors, and people hold them accountable for that. Then I also think, and TikTok amplified this to some extent, there was a cultural narrative that I don't endorse what a lot of them flocked to, in that I'm very critical of Trump, I'm very critical of kind of modern right-wing politics, but that pushed a lot of young Gen Z men away from the left and away from the cultural left that Gen Z women, many were drawn to. I mean, you can only hear like explicitly said that men are trash and like fuck all men so many times on social media before you start listening to terrible people like Andrew Tate who tell you actually men are awesome, right? And so, but whether it's that or whether it's kind of the Democratic Party's embrace of an identity politics that in certain spheres makes young, white, heterosexual men in particular feel like they're problematic by virtue of their existence. And I think the Democrats, many have started to reckon with and move away from that. But peak 2020 era, it was pretty extreme. And I think a lot of that fueled people towards Joe Rogan or these other platforms that then liberals pretty foolishly seeded, right? Part of the reason that many of these podcasts skewed so right-wing is because the hosts actually don't know anything about politics, so can just be led wherever they want by the guests. And for a long time, many Democrats and progressives wouldn't go on them. They didn't want to, talk to somebody who has had transphobic tweets or something. But in reality, it's like, okay, he still has millions of viewers, and you're trying to convince the public of your opinion. I see this changing, but not enough, and I think some of the damage is done with some of these young men who've been pushed away.
Jamie, do you want to?
I think a huge thing that a lot of the media doesn't cover a lot is the resurgence of Gen Z going back to church. And there's been a big religious revival amongst young people. You're seeing, I think, since 2018 to 2024, it's been 4 times the amount of Gen Z, particularly, especially Gen Z men, are going back to church because they are craving tradition. They're craving community. During COVID, people were split up. And I always talk about this. I went to Berkeley, and so I really understand how leftism works. I went to school there for 4 years. And it's kind of a pseudo-religion, whether it be talking about pronouns or that hyper-focus on identity politics. And that religious element, I think, was very alienating for people because it just is chaotic and it's not based in true salvation. It's not based in true faith. And so I think it also created a very nihilistic worldview. And people went back to church because they want to go back to traditions and they want to go back to clear roles, but that there is a difference between men and women. And that motherhood is the most fulfilling thing. I absolutely love my career, but being a mom is the most fulfilling thing in my life. And the fact that young women are fed on a regular basis, that getting married is oppressive and becoming a mom is oppressive, and the best way to fulfillment is get an abortion and work all day in an office, I think is damaging towards people, and people are going against that. And I mean, the left can't even say what a woman is at this point. And so they can't define what a woman is. And so when you can't even define to younger people what a woman is, and you're telling people to use their pronouns all the time, and you're telling people if their certain race or their gender is bad, you're going to see people are alienated by that.
Okay, so you think the messaging has been wrong. Dean, you are expert in the messaging. Come back on that without, if you can, turning it into a massive political.
This is,
and I appreciate.
This is going to be a little bit hard for me to navigate, but I'll do my best. Just so I have a better understanding of some of the things that you just said, would you mind sharing with us a workable definition of leftism?
I would say the hyper-focus on, I would say wokeism is a lot to do with leftism.
Well,
and
what's wokeism?
I would say it's a hyper-focus on people's identity and these structures of oppression.
Okay. Hyper-focused on people's identities.
Whether that be their gender, their race,
well, sure.
their sexual identity.
Here's my thoughts.
And then I would say leftism has also the component of, socialism in the economic field and open borders. So
open borders.
Yeah.
Yeah. Open borders, everybody.
Yeah, Joe Biden only let in, 12 million people.
Well, now you're getting definitely
really
straying way over the line into my...
I'm barely holding back.
And if you've seen Dean in full flow, by the way, which I have been watching this week, I appreciate you don't agree with that, and lots of people don't. Regardless,
sure.
The point, of course.
No,
of course.
take it.
No. Come back. But the thing I'm really interested in still is, like, whether or not you agree with the points that Jamie's making. Like,
sure.
The real thing that Jamie's saying, regardless if you agree or disagree, is that you feel like the messaging that was coming from the left at that period of time was alienating for a lot of young people. That's basically what you're saying. Whether you agree or disagree with the political points, it's exactly what Brad was saying as well. Do you agree with that?
Phenomenal. Well, I think from a position of privilege, equality can seem like oppression. And I think something that the left has really failed at in recent history is finding a way to make that clear with the use of educational content and not saying, just coming out with like the one-liners of, I don't know, like men suck or whatever. But I don't know. I haven't heard that. I'm a man. I'm huge in left-leaning politics. And I mean, there's a couple other things that you'd said there about how marriage is oppressive. I don't know where that one came from. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that marriage is oppressive. I don't think I've heard
that's
that
fed in
but we're not here to here to debate marriage. Like,
okay.
we're really
no, that is fed to women.
No, but Jamie, come on, you've got a good go.
I'll take your word for it.
Let Brad.
And then maybe.
Can I just ask you a question though? You're saying
you had a good go.
Sure, go ahead.
Jamie had a good go. Dean's being very restrained because I've seen him. I've seen him when he's not, and I appreciate it. He's outnumbered on the panel, and he's listened very quietly while you've both had to say it. Let's let Dean talk and go for it, man.
Okay, here's my takeaway. So about the marketing of the left, I think that the biggest issue with why we've seen this trend in younger Americans going more to the right isn't the idea that we don't know how to define what a woman is, but it's more so the idea that the right has been able to ingrain themselves in the culture. Rather, if you're a man going to the gym looking to your favorite gym influencer on the internet, chances are they support Trump, or a woman interested in learning how to bake sour bread dough. You were telling me earlier, chances are the content creator giving that to you supports Trump, and I feel like the root of this issue has to do with issues within the DNC and the Democratic Party not necessarily being as good as they could be at their messaging. Now, something you said there at the end is that it's about the policy. Well, I would say that the policy of the left is a whole lot better than the policy of the right. On one hand, we have a party that wants to get nearly $1 trillion from Medicaid. On the other hand, we have a party that wants to give tax cuts to 100 million American workers in the low and the middle class. The issue isn't with that. The issue is with how the left then turns around and tells America, here's what we want to do for you, and ingrains themselves into the culture. And, you know, there's a couple other things that you said there about the border crisis under Joe, or what a woman is. If I get the green light, I'd love to have that discussion with you too.
Can we stay on the?
That's a whole nother show.
So on the messaging though, Dean specifically. So you're kind of.
You're going to say this without making any political points?
No. I mean, this is specifically about what you asked about.
Okay.
You were just involved in an effort to organize an anti-Trump tour called the Unfuck America Tour. Well, guess what, guys?
I like this audience.
The Unfuck America Tour descended into chaos over imaginary microaggressions that occurred in a TikTok live. I watched the whole live. The microaggressions, which is not a real concept, first of all. Yeah. To the extent that it is, there were no microaggressions on the call. In fact, the white woman accused of microaggression was actually pretty vociferously racially abused by the women on the TikTok live. They tried to organize a tour to resist Trump, all the liberal stars of TikTok, Dean and many of his friends, and it imploded over internal fighting over microaggressions. That's not a messaging problem. I don't know what is.
You're going to say that's the case. He's obviously going to say that's not the case.
No, that is what happened. He just thinks the microaggressions are real.
I think you're hitting
I would love to add on here, maybe as a person involved.
Can I just bring it back to the reason we're here?
I don't know if the audience wants to hear about the Unfuck America tour.
I mean, definitely some of them do. It's obviously very popular with some people. It's obviously not popular with other people.
I thought it was funny.
Regardless, and regardless of the policy stuff, and we're definitely not here to talk about the border crisis. And honestly, I know I've seen you do it. What I was really interested in what you said just then in your restrained answer about the messaging from the DNC. Talk to me, and you're an expert on this, right? You look at your numbers, you're an expert on this. What are they getting wrong as a party, and what should they be doing if they are going to revive themselves from the bit of a shit show it is at the moment?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that they got wrong before the election...
And, sorry, not talking about policy now, I'm talking about messaging and the stuff that you do.
Okay, so I'd say that half of what they got wrong was their messaging as it related to the policy of the last administration. But if you more so want an answer regarding broader society, what I would say there is just simply the idea that the Democratic Party has really failed at ingraining themselves in the culture. Right? At ingraining themselves in podcasts that are popular amongst young men and women, at ingraining themselves in businesses, gyms, as I already pointed out, et cetera. And I think that is one part where the Democrat Party really failed prior to the election. But I do think that the bigger part, and you can cut me off if this isn't online. I'm just...
You probably get a minute of it, to be fair, mate.
I'm truly just trying to describe what I believe was a big issue with why more young Americans went to the right, was responding to critiques that the right had of the left. I think that for the last 4 years, there's been a plethora of false arguments thrown at the left about the administration causing inflation or recklessly spending or passing economic policy that was terrible for the middle class working American. But then we didn't see this response either from the administration or the DNC saying, well, that's not right. that's wrong, and here's why, we kind of just saw them brush it under the rug. And I think if the Democratic Party wants to excel in the future, well, we're going to need to see a party that's more willing to ingrain themselves in the culture and kind of take the right head on. And I'm pretty sure that's what a lot of Democrats across America are now picking up, such as, if anybody here is familiar with him, Zohran Mamdani from New York, ran as a Democratic socialist. A socialist ran in the Democratic Party for the primary mayoral ticket. A year and a half ago, he was an absolute nobody, and since then, he's been able to take down Andrew Cuomo via this messaging on the internet of taking, the right head on. Here's what I want to do for you. Here's why the other side of the aisle was really bad with what they want to do for you. That's what we need to see on the macro scale of the Democratic Party and the totality of America, not just one city in New York.
Brad, if you can take your political hat off and just be objectively critical as a content creator about what Mamdani did versus what you've seen generally from the Dems over the last few years, would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I disagree with Mamdani's ideas and his ideology. I mean, just a few years ago, he was tweeting, "Abolish the police for queer liberation." It's real, look it up. But I agree with you. He literally went and interviewed Trump supporters on the street, listened to their concerns, and said, here's why actually I have the solutions. That is a million miles away from basket of deplorables. And when you're talking about political candidates, your job is to win votes. He's charismatic, he's energetic, he's young. Politicians keep dying in office. That's not normal, guys. Dead members of Congress keep putting out tweets.
Yeah.
I mean, and so the Democrats and the Republicans both need youthful energy. They need people who are willing to engage. I think Zohran, it fits into that category well.
Right. And if I could real quick, one reason why I think that's really important is because of a proclivity that I see on the other side of the aisle, which is this willingness just to lie. Right?
Oh,
I'd say this is a really important point that for some reason I haven't brought up yet, but maybe one really big driver behind this trend of conservatism in our youth is, this new figure, Donald Trump, coming into the scenes of politics, not really showing a proclivity to be like any other politician in the sense that he is so totally willing just to lie to the faces of the average everyday American. He's willing to look you in the eye and tell you that the sky's yellow.
But come on,
But
we've had politicians. I mean, everyone thinks politicians are liars, right?
There's a difference. There's a difference. I agree that politicians are not known to be the most honest people in the world, but Donald Trump is the only politician in modern American history that I can think of that told the biggest lie that any sitting president has ever told as it related to his denial of the outcome of the 2020 election until today and his ability to convince 71% of Republicans.
Do you think that Joe Biden lying about his mental state was a threat?
Now, if you want to call that a threat, tell me about the 30,000 plus we see from the other side of the aisle.
Now we're getting into
it. Jamie, not on politics. I would like to pick up on with Trump. I think what he's done really well in his campaign is using new media and new content creators. He has them in the press room, and whether you like Trump or not, he is the most transparent. And whether you like him, he is talking to everybody all the time. Anyone can reach him. He's willing to do a video here, video there, talk to someone, comes up with a mic, and he's giving his opinion. And I think that resonates with people that want true authenticity in this day and age, and that resonates with young people.
About the second half of your statement, being willing to put himself out there and talk to people. For the most part, I mean, in some senses I could agree, in other senses I could disagree. About the first half of the statement, Trump is transparent. Elon Musk disagrees.
It's amazing, as an outsider, which I am, to all of this, it's amazing to me, President Biden was obviously really old. President Trump is also really old, right?
Yeah.
And yet, we have him turning out very young voters in unexpected numbers. People didn't see it coming, particularly the younger cohort of Gen Z. You think you're putting that down to authenticity, is it? Are you? You think that he creates a connection with, teenagers in a way that your average politician was not able to do?
Yeah, I mean, and during the last election, he sat down on Joe Rogan for 2+ hours. He went on Theo Vaughn for 2+ hours. And truthfully, I just think that a lot of Democrats aren't able to do that because I think that there's so many different offenses. I'm going to offend this person. I remember like Seth Moulton after the last election, he came out and he's like, I understand why people, felt like they didn't want men and women's sports, and he was crucified. And so a lot of these issues, if you are sitting down on a podcast, you have to really go down into what you believe and what you think. And I think on the right, we're able to have more intellectual disagreements on things, and we're able to have a bigger spectrum in our party, and there's not as much of a purity like there is on the left.
But we're starting to see that now from the Dems, though, aren't we, Brad? I watched Pete Buttigieg do about 19-hour podcast interview. Well, I didn't watch it all, honestly, but I read the transcript.
I think he's an effective messenger, actually. And it's interesting that when he was in the Biden administration, he was one of their only officials to regularly appear on Fox News.
That's true.
Because a shocking number of Democrats and independents tune into Fox News in the middle of the country. And if you want to reach those people, you've got to go on the platforms. Kamala Harris did one interview with Fox during the campaign, but typically administration officials under Biden wouldn't go on there. But just on the Trump thing, I think in a way he's transparent in that I do agree he lies a lot, and he lies more than past politicians, I do think. But there's something endearing about how transparent he is, and he's funny. You have to give him that. But I think part of the problem is that there was such a boy who cried wolf phenomenon, which with how liberal discourse and mainstream media treated Republican politicians for so long. I mean, Joe Biden told a room full of black people that Mitt Romney was going to put y'all back in chains. About Mitt Romney, you can go find that footage. And so basically, I think that the racism, sexism, homophobia, all these labels were thrown around so loosely for so long and so overused that especially among young people who've just grown up in an environment where these things are invoked frivolously constantly, someone came along who frankly has some of those things, and the people in his orbit, certainly I think someone like Stephen Miller couldn't be adequately described as a fascist. But the problem is I don't think that word means a lot to a lot of people because it's been overused to describe boilerplate Republicans for a long time. So I find it very frustrating as somebody who's very critical of both of the current party.
People are over the political correctness. They just want truth. They want to have a discussion. And the left has overdone that, especially with Gen Z. We've had this in our education system forced down on us. And young people like to rebel. And so now being conservative, you're like rebelling against what the teacher telling you to, walk into class and list out your pronouns. People don't want to do that anymore. The average person doesn't. And they don't want to be lectured and condescended to.
I'm going to ring a 5-minute bell before we get into questions, or maybe a 4-minute bell. So have a think. And I'm going to warn you guys, you're not going to turn it into a massive political argument either. I've got my eye on you. We're doing a Politico cocktail drink over there in a minute, and you won't be invited if you start a fight. Before we do that, you mentioned Fox News. I work for Politico, as my pin badge says. I guess we're traditional media these days, although we used to be a new media startup not that long ago. How much of a role is there still, from a Gen Z point of view, for traditional media? Dean, do you use traditional media to get the information to then go forth and speak?
So I do mix. Some of what I consume is traditional media, but that's always on the internet. I haven't turned on the TV to sit down and watch a live CNN or MSNBC broadcast since I was on an MSNBC broadcast months ago. And I would say that's more of a special case because the only reason I'm really keeping in the loop with more traditional media is just to fact check the information that I'm being provided to me before I turn around and call myself a reliable source.
But you do use the traditional media to fact check, because that's interesting in itself. Right?
A comparison of sources. I think that something is more likely to be true, given that there's a preponderance of evidence to be the case, and more so in media and politics, more people are reporting on it being the case. Now, I think a combination of those factors is kind of what I would use to reliably score either the truthfulness or the unlikelihood to be truthfulness of any given reporting. But for the average younger American, I would say, as we started the conversation off by speaking about, that they're not looking at Politico, they're not looking at AP, they're going onto TikTok and seeing somebody like Aaron Parnas giving a 60-second recap of something big that just happened in the White House.
Basically, though, the creators like Aaron Parnas, no shade to him personally, basically just rip off and repackage the actual reporting the Associated Press is doing. Sometimes they credit it, but still they're making like thousands of dollars from this video where they're just summing up a news story they just read. So I actually feel bad for traditional media because they're basically getting content farmed by people who then don't transform or add that much. People like us, we add a lot of commentary and opinion and analysis. So like I'll read a story and then I'll talk about it for 10 minutes. There's a whole ecosystem of people who literally just type into ChatGPT, sum up this AP News article in a 30-second script. And they do it, then they read it into the camera. Boom, 3 million views.
I see your point.
Boom,
I see your
$2,000, $1,500. I feel bad for mainstream media.
I see your point. I do. I just still do think it's really, really useful to keeping young Americans informed. So, I mean, I think what you're saying is true, but like simultaneously, we got to kind of do like a, what are the pros, what are the cons?
Yeah.
It's a con, I'd definitely say there are news reporters that'll just go look at what AP is saying and copy and paste. But the AP reporters are getting paid for their time. They're disseminating information that's supposed to be true. Everybody should have access to the truth. And
but AP's losing the views and like, is AP a nonprofit model?
No, they want to make money.
So the viability
to pay for their journalists
of these
and,
services,
they're a huge organization.
I worry about a little bit also with AI.
It's a good point to make. I think that there's pros and cons.
Jamie, you mentioned earlier the sort of collapse in trust in mainstream media, and every survey bears that out. It's obviously a fact. Do you see a future for traditional media with your generation? Do you think this blended approach is it, or are we just slowly going to see one wither on the vine as you guys get older and older?
Well, I think that the news is always adapting. Like 25 years ago, people watched a lot more local news, and then it kind of went to cable news, and then it went to more written news, and now it's a lot of podcasting. I think it's always evolving, and I think if the mainstream media wants to get its credibility back, it needs to represent more voices. And I'm not saying that the mainstream media should all be conservative. That's not what I think is healthy for our country. But I have seen example like the Washington Post or LA Times, signing on different columnists and everything to kind of, I think, earn some credibility back with people. But I don't think mainstream media will ever exist as it did, even 5 years ago with this whole new media sphere. And I think when we're talking also about like young people as well, we're talking about like high propensity voters versus like low propensity voters. And I think what the Republican Party did a really great job was they infiltrated non-political parts, whether that be on TikTok or on Instagram through the influencer culture, through the manosphere, the women's sphere. And the left didn't do as good of a job with that. And not everybody's as politically engaged as people in this room and are on X scrolling and catching up with the news every second. So in order to connect with, not just younger people, but people in general who are not watching the news all the time, you have to infiltrate into different spheres for them.
It's absolutely true.
Okay, agreement. We got there. Thank you. Well done. Thank you. All right. I promised I'd leave the last 15 minutes or so for questions. We haven't quite got that left, but I can see loads of hands in the room. That's brilliant. I'll stress it one more time. We're not here for a political row. We're here to talk about TikTok. I'll start with the lady right in the middle. Please don't shout out your question. There are people walking around with microphones. There's a lady here in the dark blue who's had her hand up for quite a while, actually. Right, sitting here. Yeah, yes, you, ma'am. If you just pop your hand up, the person with the microphone will be right with you, and then everyone can hear your question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Liz Clay-Roy, and I lead Generation Citizen, which does civics education with middle and high school students, so Gen Alpha and Gen Z. Really interested in everything you said, and teachers are asking us to bring media literacy into civics, I think because of what you've said. I'm curious your different points of view on the appropriate role of schools in civics education, and interested, Jamie, you kind of made a point about conservatism being a rebellion from what's happening in the classroom. So curious what you make of the role of schools in preparing all students to really understand civics.
And are you talking about to understand like politics, or are you talking about being critical of media when you say that?
So initially civics and understanding how government works,
right.
But increasingly what teachers are telling us is to understand civics, we have to help students understand media.
Got it. So it's both, really. Jamie?
I think civics education is an amazing idea. I mean, if you ever watch like people up on the street, interviewing people, most people couldn't even say how many senators we have or what branches of government. So I think that would be amazing. In terms of like injecting, if you're talking about that like political opinion, I think in a public school that shouldn't exist. If you're sending your child to a private education that has some sort of mission attached to it, then I think that is a choice you're making as a parent to send your kid there. Just like I'll make the choice to send my child to a Christian school because I want that type of education. But I think we need to just be teaching students in public schools way more about just how our government works, how a bill is passed. It's actually ridiculous to me that I think our education system has really failed on that. So I'm really happy to hear that you're advocating for that.
About 50% of Americans can't name the 3 branches of government.
I would think it's higher.
You would think, but I've seen data that suggests it's about 50%. I think that's a crisis. I think we have a crisis of civics literacy in this country.
Absolutely.
And so I think it should be taught just the bare bones. What is the Senate? What is the House? How many terms can a president serve? Like, I'm astonished by how much people aren't familiar with this stuff anymore, so it should be further focused on.
Well, what I will say is I'm pretty sure that in school districts across America, they do have that standardized curriculum to inform their juniors and seniors in high school about the basics of civics. I just think that this speaks towards a larger issue of why does our education system suck so much, and how do we get the children more interested? But as it relates to the latter half of your question, preparing our students for media literacy, I think that what you said can be true, and what you want can also happen by not necessarily pushing political opinions on the students, but just simply teaching the students on how to rationally form their political opinions, giving them the framework to build from the ground up, here are what my core beliefs are, and based upon these core beliefs, here's how I distinguish between what is true and what is false to better develop my understanding of American politics. And I think that can be the role of school teachers across this country.
All right, hands up. We'll take the gentleman at the back in the dark blue shirt with the glasses, just spectacles there. Yeah, just there, sir. Into the mic, please.
Hello.
Yeah.
I'd like to, we haven't talked about freedom of speech and how it seems to have become a shield for the producers of content to say whatever they want without penalty, and the distributors of it to say, well, we trust that our consumers will recognize the bad information, sniff it out, and not be deceived. Well, that's like StarKist selling me bad tuna, and when I get sick eating it, I should have smelled the can better to determine whether or not it was accurate. What is your position on mediated content to reduce the amount of intentionally false information being fed to me?
All right, thank you. That's a very good question. I'm going to start with Brad, actually.
So I think it's a real problem. I see misinformation on TikTok. I see it on X all the time with different political valences. I don't trust any central authority, particularly a government authority, to decide what is true and what is false. And I would rather have a messy, chaotic, free flow of misinformation than have a centralized authority with that kind of power. That said, I don't think we're helpless in the face of what is a very real problem. I think the solution is teaching people media literacy to critically think, and also community-based things, like even Community Notes on X has brutally fact-checked Elon Musk multiple times on his own website. So that's given me some faith that you can implement things that come short of kind of centralized censorship, but still provide context or facts or challenge misinformation or false information that's spreading like wildfire.
I couldn't agree more. I don't think there should be a central authority. Obviously, there are downsides that come with free speech. People can peddle out terrible, horrible ideas, but sunlight is the best disinfectant. And when you see people are putting out stuff into the public square and it's creating a conversation, you see, like you said, with the community notes, you see it's called being ratioed on X when people put out something ridiculous and 1 million people are in the comments disproving that. And I think the hallmark of every single communist authoritarian regime is the suppression of free speech. And so although it's not a perfect system, we have the First Amendment for a reason, and that is what makes America a huge part of what makes America the freest and best country in the world.
Dean?
I think that there's a healthy medium. So I think that some of the points that both of you just made about not having a centralized government kind of decide everything for the consumers of these platforms and what they can or can't post or what is true and isn't true. I think that there's a lot of scenarios where you guys are spot on. We shouldn't have that, because then those who are in power can control what is true and what is false. So I think that the happy medium is saying, well, okay, here is a base set of facts that can't be false. And if somebody says they're false, take their post down, No.
How did that work out in COVID?
I think that
Facebook labeled the lab leak theory disinformation and took down experts. Now the FBI
if you allow me to finish speaking, Brad, What I'm saying is I don't think that if an election hinged on 50% of the population believing that, the Earth was flat, you should be able to go on Twitter and tell 1 million people that the Earth is flat. Now, with that being said, what I will also say is that the advent of decentralized forms of accountability, such as community notes on X, is something that I love. I couldn't agree with you two more. I think that there should be some base facts that should be protected, not by a government, but by the mediators of these platforms. But then anything outside of these base facts that can't be contested, regardless of your political ideology, some decentralized form of accountability, such as community notes on X, is a great thing. And on that, we can agree completely.
But the facts are the heart of the dispute.
I think when you
when
you censor people, it creates more conspiracies.
When you censor people, it creates more
because they feel when you censor people, they think there's a conspiracy there. And so I think, like I said, it's best to have open dialogue and debate. That's the healthiest thing for our nation. I think people get conspiratorial when you censor them.
Want to come back on that?
When you censor people, it creates more conspiracies. I don't know. I mean, let's look at platforms that don't censor at all. Rumble. Who do we see on there? Nick Fuentes. What does he spend 4 hours a day doing? Convincing people that the Holocaust didn't happen. So I don't know if you're right.
Well, I completely disagree with everything he has to say, but it's his First Amendment right in this nation, just like it's Zoran's First Amendment right to say things.
What I was specifically responding to was the idea that censorship creates conspiracy, because obviously what we see with some of the largest conspirators in this country is that the only reason they have the reach that they do is because of a lack of any and all censorship.
No,
Dean, Dean, do you remember what they did to President Trump after 2020, after January 6th?
Yeah, this is dangerous.
No. Every social media platform deleted his account. And did he go away?
He's president.
He did not.
That's also true.
That's also true. Okay, let's try and get some more questions. We haven't got very much more time. Lady right at the front here, thank you. But please wait for the mic. Sorry, I'm making you run around, aren't I? I'm going to do one right over there next.
By the way, these are some good questions.
Yeah, they really are. Thank you. Lady in the pink right here.
Hi, I'm a high school teacher in Texas, and I run a student voter empowerment club, and it is a big conversation of getting youth out to vote, the 18 to 25-year-old range. I just looked it up to fact check myself, but there was not more 18 to 25-year-olds that voted this time than in 2020. It was like a little bit less. So my question to all three of you, because I think to your point, you said earlier about how kids don't like being told what to do. If I look at them in the eye and say, you should go vote, they're gonna be like, I'm gonna rebel against that. That's a very true statement. So what can we do to inspire 18 to 25-year-olds to vote? Because some of my students were saying that TikTok, while they were interested in watching videos, it delegitimized candidates for them.
Interesting. That is a great question, and one that, frankly, generations of politicians and media have been grappling with. How do you get young people out to vote? Who's got a take on that? Do you want to start? Yeah.
Honestly, being young and when they would be like, get out to vote, get out, it was actually annoying, I'll say that. I think people, Brad, you talked about earlier, people have trusted people that they look up to and these influencer types online, and I think I think when we're talking about in the education system, I think it's good to have this is election day, but I think forcing any type of ideology or really pushing people, I think you are gonna see a rebellion with young people. So I think providing that information, but if you really do want to turn out younger people, not doing it in a forceful way to them.
Dean, go on.
I think a way to get young people to turn out is appealing to their other senses, right? Because, something you just said was, well, and you just tell them to get out there and vote, they want to rebel, it's annoying. And, maybe I thought, a similar way when I was 16. But I think the best thing we could do as a country to get younger Americans to go to the polls is to appeal to their interests and their other senses. Like, for instance, what I do through the political debates that I host every single day is I'm appealing to the interests of younger Americans because their first thought when they see me screaming at some Trump supporters, hey, this is entertaining. But then as they watch it more, it goes from I'm going to eat my popcorn, sit back and relax, to I'm actively engaged in learning more about American politics, and all of a sudden I want to go out there and do something to help in this change myself, and that could direct more individuals to being more engaged and going to the polls every 2 and 4 years.
So maybe the TikTok is part of the answer to the question, right. Maybe.
But it's a broader scope. It's not just one person. It is it is a whole culture.
This is controversial to say, but if someone's not interested in politics, not educated, they don't have to vote. They don't. I think the strongest way that we have a democracy is that people are educated and passionate and they're heading to the polls. And so, like I said, that's controversial, but not everybody has to. If you are not interested, then I don't really necessarily want someone's opinion involved in this. I'd rather someone on any side that's interested, passionate, and excited. And that was a hallmark that Thomas Jefferson talked about when creating our democracy.
I actually think that voting is pretty low down the list in things you can do to impact your community or improve your country. Not to say it's not one, but to say that you can make a much bigger difference than that in real people's lives around you. If you're passionate about environmentalism, volunteering for an environmental cleanup. We're going to do a beach cleanup next week with one of the groups I'm affiliated with in Miami. It does more in reality than casting a national ballot based on environment in many cases. So I would encourage them to think about political impact, not just in terms of voting.
I don't know. The moment we discourage those that are subject to those in power to not hold those in power accountable is the moment we enable those in power to do whatever they want.
Well, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying you can make a more immediate impact in your local community. We are powerless
there's many other things that you could do.
And it's a quick path to despair, to just think about how terrible everything is going all the time. And I think a path to fulfillment is making a small life better near you in real life.
All right, that is a wonderful note, a positive note to end on. I'm sorry to everyone that's got their hands up. We've been talking for a whole hour on stage, and I, for one, need a real drink. So I'm gonna wrap it up there. Please give it up to the panel. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you, guys. Thank you all for coming. I have to say, I'm obliged to say, Politico is doing a nightcap cocktails drinks right now at the West End Social. I have to go on stage there right now. You're all welcome. Come over for a drink and come and meet us. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.